Put them back. I was pointing out how atrocious your socks are.
The
I
white
wasn't saying they
socks?
were in frame. Yeah.
You can wear white socks with brown shoes. Just can't wear them with black shoes. Yeah, they do look a little nerdy.
Yeah, they do.
At least they're not like high socks.
You gotta get they're high enough that they're pretty bad.
You think these are high?
Yeah, you gotta get the ones that go underneath the shoes.
No.
This looks really bad because actually not only can you see the sock, you can also see your skin. So you've got just a lot going on down there. Welcome to the EmberMap podcast, where we talk about design and development in the world of ember.js. I'm Sam.
I'm Ryan.
And if you like what you hear today, you can find more of our work on embermap.com. All right, so we have some fun stuff to talk about today.
Yep.
We wanted to start with this talk that we both watched. Did you finish watching it?
I did. I finished it today.
Nice. This was a talk from Sebastian M.
Yeah, Sebmac.
Sebastian Markbage. Actually, Sebmac, is that Sebastian McKenzie? He made this point in his talk. There's another Sebastian that's easily confused.
The
Babel guy.
Yeah.
This is not the Babel guy, but he does work at Facebook on React. And he had a talk called DOM as a Second-Class Citizen.
Mm-hmm. It's a couple of years old. It's from like 2015.
And it's surprising how relevant it still was.
It's super relevant, and not only it's about React, but it's super relevant to Ember developers.
Very applicable to basically the entire idea of declarative UIs.
Yeah.
And that's why it resonated so strongly when I watched it. The premise is basically the DOM is an implementation detail of our applications.
Right, of our UIs.
Of our UIs. Whereas if you learned web development, 10 years ago, HTML, the semantics, the structure, the tags, the appropriate use was a first-class citizen. It was what it meant to be a web developer was to know how to code HTML.
Right. And so I really like the example that he opens the talk up with. He has, I think it's like a tooltip or a pop-up or something. I actually can't remember. But this idea that it's a bunch of HTML in a React component.
It had an anchor tag.
An anchor
bunch
tag.
Of href and ARIA labels.
Right. And there was a button in there. And I think as an Ember developer and you're thinking about declarative rendering, you think, okay, well, I can use HTML. HTML is declarative, right? HTML describes exactly what you want it to render. But this idea that like the DOM isn't declarative, the DOM is imperative, and the way you interact with the DOM is through a bunch of imperative APIs. So one area where I've noticed this is like our video player. There's no real declarative API for our video player. So
here, I went
way.
No, it's good, but there's a lot here. So let's go back and unwrap some of this. So the HTML is declarative, and what that means is, I'll say this back to you and then see if it makes sense. So this means like you open an index.html file and you see a p tag with some text and an h1 tag with a title. I can basically tell you what that's going to look like if that's rendered by the browser.
Yeah.
And as opposed to code that was kind of appending things, jQuery code that was adding a lot of things, doing lots of imperative steps. It's hard to look at that. It's not a declaration of what the UI is, but at a very low level, HTML is. Mm-hmm. So then what he goes on to say, and what you were just saying, is that the DOM, which is not the same thing as HTML, right? The DOM is a document object model, which is basically when the browser reads your HTML and it reads it into memory, into an object model that it uses to help add functionality and behavior to our apps. And all of those, basically the tree of HTML nodes is read into memory, into this object model, and that's what the DOM is. Mm-hmm. And the DOM has APIs of its own that aren't HTML, right? We interact with it with JavaScript, and we can do things like set attributes on the nodes that are live in this DOM and other things, but that's where the boundary changes, becomes imperative, right?
Right.
So basically, HTML is declarative, the DOM is imperative. When we used to add behavior and interaction to our web apps by interacting directly with the DOM, we were writing imperative code, which is easy for it to be buggy. And then declarative rendering revolution came along with Ember and Angular and React components. And now we author components in a declarative way, because that brings us back to this nice style of programming that has less bugs.
Yep. So we've noticed this in EmberMap where we have a video player component.
Right. So
the video API, it's .play and .pause. And so you think like...
You're saying from the DOM. If you use an HTML video element and you want to make it start or stop, you have to grab it in an instance of it in JavaScript and call .play on it.
And yeah, exactly.
As opposed to a declarative API, which would be...
like a render a video tag with play equals true equals curly is playing.
Right.
And then I can turn it on and off.
Right.
Can't do that.
And that gets back to this idea where if you showed me a template that had video is playing equals true, I can predict what the UI will look like.
Right.
Whereas if you have a bunch of code and some of it says play.start and play.stop, I can't tell you what the UI will look like, which is one of the things that makes imperative programming hard.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so he kind of makes this point that the DOM is imperative, but our components and our UIs, we want them more and more to be declarative. We want them to be as declarative as possible. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to write a video player in your app, you should make it, an Ember component, a React component, and wrap the imperative part of the API into a declarative API so that the developers can do play equals curly is playing. Mm-hmm. And that makes your app predictable and easy to use, right?
Well, I have a question. In EmberApp, how would we do that? Would we use an observer that says like ember.observe, is playing, video.play, video.pause?
How do we do it in EmberMap?
I think we use did receive adders.
Did receive adders. So
when the thing receives new adders, we know to pause it or we know to play it.
Right. So if the curly had changed, then within the implementation of the player, we can see that the adder changed, and then we can call start or stop. But again, the rest of the developers don't ever have to know that.
Right. So when we're thinking of our video player, we're thinking declaratively.
Right.
And then when we, open the hood, when we need to make edits, then we can get into the imperative API.
Into the raw API of the DOM.
But this is the idea of we're thinking as a DOM as a second-class citizen.
Right. So this is kind of feeding back into his larger point, which is that obviously as web developers, we need to know HTML and CSS because they're the building blocks. And if I'm going to go build a video player, I want to build them using, when I need to get something done, I want to use HTML and CSS because they're standard. There's Stack Overflow questions.
You know them.
They're
right? Going to work in every app.
They're going to work in every app. But when I'm building the application, the benefits of declarative programming are huge. So we've known the benefits of declarative programming, and we've taught them, and we try to use them in our own apps. But Sebastian takes the idea one step further. And we're looking at this template that he has that has some components and some DOM code. And what he says is, again, when you're programming a feature and you open this, you've got components that are specific to your domain, and then you're seeing like an A tag with an href as a hash and an ARIA label, and all of these super low level things that are at a completely different level of abstraction than the business logic you're trying to build. And so he kind of pushes this whole notion, this whole idea to its logical conclusion and says, what an interesting thought experiment to be is to open up a page of your app and ask, how could I build this without using any DOM at all? So any HTML at all. Mm-hmm. So
what is that? Why? What are the benefits?
So what are the benefits of that? So the idea is, if I'm looking at a part of Twitter and I want to break down the UI, if we were talking about it and just looking at it, we're not going to be using divs.
Right. We're not going to say, oh, that's a div with a nested div.
Exactly. Oh, here I see a UL, right?
We're going to say button. We're going to say card. We're going to say
list,
tweet.
Tweet, exactly. Header, sign out button, exactly. And so that's a certain level of abstraction, and the implementation is the implementation. Just like if you were talking about an interface in code, the implementation is separate. You don't care if it uses a linked list under the hood. It's not relevant to what you're talking about. So you're talking about the method signature, you're talking about the arguments it takes, all these things. And so this idea, I think, is really powerful because, first of all, it reinforces the fact that our templates, if we're looking at the components that we're invoking, I mean, really they are functions. And so we should be thinking about this entire thing as kind of the public interface of our app for other developers to build features. And so they should all exist at the same abstraction level, just like other code that we write. And when you have a sortable list component that has some functionality with it, and then you have some divs and Ps and stuff like this, it's different, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, like, okay, this is kind of like a theoretical argument, and in practice, you have lots of templates. They're going to have divs, and they're going to have little utility classes, or they're going to have some classes that help with spacing. And most of an app comes down to like HTML tags and CSS. And so I think if someone was listening to this, they would say, well, yeah, but most of that template is familiar because it's just HTML and CSS. And so if everything was kind of a component specific to the domain, it could make the cognitive load required to understand this.
Yeah, I would say, sure, if you have like 300 components, if your HTML is so different that in order to express your app, you need 300 different, buttons and spacers and whatever. But I don't know. In reality, I might say that maybe there's 20 or so UI components that you can express your app in.
Right. And that's also corresponds to, if you look at an app, you can probably talk about it using, a dozen UI components.
Right.
Which means you should have a dozen that exist at that layer of abstraction, and those should be composed to build up that part of the app.
And I think a key thing here is when we often talk about this thing, we use terms like UI title or UI card or UI list because we want it to sound familiar to other people. But in your app, you're going to have your UI components are going to be specific to your application.
Right.
Or these components are going to be very specific to your application.
Like a tweet.
Yeah,
a tweet card
exactly,
or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
A large tweet, even in a small tweet.
So it's gonna make a lot of sense when you talk about it with other developers because everyone is going to have this shared understanding,
the shared language, and it's how you would talk about this part of HTML and CSS, anyways. Like this subtree of HTML and CSS,
right?
You have a tweet card.
Tweet. Yeah, exactly.
It's just that you happen to be looking at HTML with a class on it.
And the goal here isn't to come up with a set of components that you can then use in any app,
right?
Because you're just.
And actually, he makes the point is completely the opposite, right? And the problem when opening a template in your app that has a div and a class of capital tweet card is that you're going through a translation step where you're saying, really, I'm looking at something that's more than a div with a CSS class. I'm looking at something that represents a tweet card. But you also, as a front-end developer, know that divs have all sorts of things, right? Divs have classes. You can pass a style to a div. You can pass an on-click handler to a div. You can do all sorts of things with it. So it's completely unconstrained, which is part of the problem. It can lead to inconsistent UIs and all sorts of stuff. When really whoever made that tweet card, with components, something like an Ember component, you have the ability to restrict very much so the interface that other developers have access to. And he makes the point that with a restricted interface, obviously there's trade-offs here, like with everything, but this is also true when we're doing design in normal code. A restricted interface gives the implementer way more flexibility. So if you have a tweet card that only ever needs to show a tweet and you pass it a tweet ID, for sure every time it's used, it's going to be used how you intend. And now you as editor of tweet card, the implementation side, if something changes, let's say you change the color blue that this button renders in or the font style, you can change it everywhere that tweet card is used works. Whereas when you have low-level DOM that's being used to actually render the tweet card, you've lost a lot of that flexibility internally.
Right. So if you're using a div tag, someone can pass in a brand new class.
Exactly.
That sets its own font. And now if you change the font, you might start messing with them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of power in limited interfaces, right? But it's also hard because, as we all know, you get into places where you need to crack open the hood to make some new feature work. But again, his argument is, if you approach app development by saying that it's our job as developers, and specifically developers on this project, to use our shared domain language and figure out the abstractions that work for us, then we end up with a set of components and abstractions that we can use to build the interface. And when something new comes along, we want to think about how to add it so that we end up with, again, good components and a consistent UI. Mm-hmm. So it's very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, one of the reasons we like talking about this is sort of the approach that we've taken to building our apps.
Yes. We haven't taken it to the extreme.
Right.
Where
we're pretty close.
We're getting close. I think it's interesting to think specifically about the layout side, how you would replace, a lot of times I just want to use a div with some spacing classes or a color or making it a larger text size, how you would decompose those into layout components where you have.
Yeah, the thing it's
You know what I'm saying?
our layouts change so much that
Right.
I feel like I don't know enough about the future of our layout.
But like if you were looking at a Medium article and you would see a paragraph tag and you can say, yeah, that's text. That's like a text component, UI text component. But then you see a paragraph tag and when a title comes after it, there's more space. When another paragraph tag comes after it, there's less space. And that's the kind of thing where you might just write some CSS that's like last child, add some padding, or maybe you add a spacer somehow. So thinking about the layout side and how those decompose into components is interesting.
Yeah, I haven't really thought about this.
I think the big takeaway from this talk for me was, basically when he said, look at a part of your app and ask yourself, how would this look if you didn't have any HTML tags in it? It would basically have to be expressed in a domain-specific language relevant for your business and your project. And so I think that's a really interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, so on one of the apps I'm working on now, it's an app with a lot of forms. I think there's probably 15 or 16 different forms throughout the app. And one of the first things we did was we made a form component. And the form component's a contextual component. It yields an object, and that object contains a whole bunch of things that you want to use in the form, like text field and date input and like an autocomplete field, and more specific domain things as well. And this was really helpful because it's great when you're looking at a mockup or you're looking at requirements, you know exactly what the component that you need to use is.
So like a masked input, something
exactly.
Complex currency scenario.
You just know you have form.currency input.
Right.
And you can use that. And it's consistent. So it does all the styling, all the error handling. It knows to run validations on submit. There's a whole bunch of different validation scenarios, and that's all those things are business logic, right? Those are things that like the business decided to do. So I was thinking, like, why isn't there like a form component with all of these fields already defined that I can just install as an add-on? This seems like a thing that would be like add-onable, right? Like every app has, date inputs and currency inputs. So why can't I Ember install this? And it's sort of, after building a few of these, I realized, like, yeah, sure, at a high level, these are, currency inputs. But once you start to peel back the layers, you realize that, yeah, it's a currency input with like 15 unique business requirements.
And you actually wouldn't want to install it.
No way, because then I would be overriding it. I'd be monkey patching it.
And it's the same. And again, taking this to the conclusion for every part of your app, it's also kind of a reason you wouldn't want to just install, Ember Bootstrap and try to shoehorn that into your interface, right? So I want to build a tweet card. I don't want to build a well or whatever Bootstrap gives me. I want to have a tweet card, and I want to have a building blocks, we would argue the functional CSS styles that are designed to help me build that tweet card on my own.
Yes.
So I want a toolkit that helps me build the tweet card on my own. I don't want to try to shoehorn in some other person's abstractions into my app.
Right. So Twitter Bootstrap has already made assumptions about what the UI is going to look like.
Exactly.
And you can compose those classes that come with Bootstrap, but they're not made
from first principles to be composed together for you to arrive with your own UI components, which when you're building an Ember app is basically how we think that it should be built.
Yep.
So yeah, a lot of interesting stuff there. Really, really cool talk. Definitely recommend folks check it out.
Yep.
So I ran into an interesting scenario working on one of my Mirage videos for EmberMap this week. It had to do with stale data and how basically client applications can get out of sync with the server.
So what do you mean by this? Like,
so let's say, with a simple app where the current client is the only user of the application and all state changes come from actions on their behalf, then it's pretty straightforward. But what if you have an app that has real-time updates from other users? And
so like a blog post app, I'm editing the blog post and then you come in and you start editing it.
Exactly. Stack Overflow, you go to edit an answer, someone else edits it while you're editing it, and you see that little box right there that says, oh, this question has been updated. Click here to refresh. So how do you do that? And I ran into something like this with Ember, and it made me think about, basically made me step back and we had a conversation about all the different ways you can handle this. And it also kind of led us to talk about how we would want to deal with this in a general way, thinking about our storefront add-on. Because Ember's data store, which we use Ember data, so Ember data store has some mechanisms for dealing with this notion of your Ember app becoming stale. So your Ember app makes requests. Let's say you visit the homepage and you load all the blog posts. And so now the question is, how long is that list of posts good for?
Well, I mean, my answer here is it's up to the application developer.
Right. So it changes, right? And if you're reading something like a Twitter feed, which is essentially a list of posts, that becomes stale very quickly, right? So there's application logic that says, maybe in 30 seconds, we're going to check again. And if there's something new, we're going to show as part of the UI.
Yeah, I would think like, WebSockets or at the crudest level, I would just have some timer that's reloading and polling. So it's just checking for new tweets, checking for new posts.
Right. So, again, we kind of had this conversation and talked about all the different ways we could handle this. You could use an Ember concurrency task and kind of pull at the router level. You could just manually, imperatively call reload on either your model or your actual route hook, refresh on your route hook. And there's some other ways we talked about it too, but it was an interesting discussion because at a high level, we realized this is really part of the code base that's usually not declarative. And kind of like we were just talking about with our UI and templates, it's nice when all of our code is declarative. And there's parts of our data loading code that's declarative, but then there's parts that aren't.
Okay. I'm not sure I follow.
Okay. So when we say store.findAll post, that's really kind of, if you think about it, it's kind of imperative. Because you're saying when the user comes into this route, make a network request to /posts and render what you get.
Right. And then let's say if on the back end the posts change, well, the model hook isn't made for when the posts change. It's made for when you enter the route.
Exactly. And so what would be a declarative way to express this part of the interface, right? Just like it's declarative to say each post, render the post. What's the declarative way to say what the data requirements are for this? Let's say for the homepage of Twitter. How would you declare what the homepage of Twitter's data requirements are?
I would say the list of my tweets, or the list of the tweets of the people I follow.
Maybe the latest 50 tweets.
Yeah. So
for the homepage, right?
But then I think the template and the route wouldn't care or know how that list gets updated.
Exactly. So that's declarative. So if you could say, if you were able to express in code, this is what this means, this is the declaration of my data needs are the latest 50 tweets for this user, then that's declarative. And if there's a way that changes, because it's declarative, your system, your libraries could actually take care of updating that for you without you having to write this imperative kind of model.reload or route.refresh.
So yeah, by saying model.reload, I'm really saying like render this list and then keep updating it like this. So I'm describing how to keep the page in sync.
Exactly. Instead of just declaring what it is you're intending for it to show.
Right. Okay.
So that led us to talk about this notion that if you could declare your data requirements, you could say, if you really had to break it down, like say you were in a business meeting with stakeholders of Twitter and they were talking about what needs to show on the homepage. It's actually not the latest the latest 50 tweets. That's not specific enough, right? As of when?
As of now. When you load the page.
When you load the page. But even that's not specific enough, because if you have the homepage open for 3 minutes, the latest 50 tweets as of 3 minutes ago is no longer actually describing your interface. It's not declarative. That's not a declaration of what you're supposed to see. It's really something like the latest 50 tweets as of if I've been looking at, it's the latest 50 tweets as of when I load the page and for the next minute. And then if it's been more than a minute, it's the latest 50 tweets as of this new time period.
I mean, I kind of feel like you're describing like a while loop though, like that imperative.
Yeah.
code.
So maybe there's maybe what you're really saying is, well, this kind of led to the expire stuff that we were talking about. So if you said if you said the latest 50 tweets as of now, and it expires in a minute, now you have a complete description of that feed, because you can say, okay, what time is it? And when was this query executed? What would I see right here?
Yeah, and that's the latest 50 tweets in the last minute.
Right. So that's really a complete declaration, a complete description of the data requirements for that route.
Now, are you imagining something like the model hook is always running in this situation? Like the model hook is constantly returning data? I mean, I guess, thinking out loud here, but I guess like Ember data returns.
It feels like an implementation detail to me, because right now when you call store.findAll, you do it as a result of the user moving through the app. So like clicking on a link. If you had this thing that said the latest 50 tweets as of a minute ago, okay, whether you use a while loop and check the server, whether you queue
Whether
up,
it's WebSockets,
WebSockets, or you could queue up something a minute from now, I know I'm going to need to fix this. But again, that's all insulated. The developer is insulated from all that.
Okay. Yep.
So that's why this is so cool, because you could, if you could get this working, now, we talk a lot about background reload, which is an API within Ember Data, and it's kind of like, okay, it kind of keeps our apps up to date.
Let's describe background reload.
What we think about background reload.
Yeah, so background reload, if I do post this.store.find record post 1, it's going to make an AJAX request, then return the post, and then my template's going to render. If I do this in the model hook.
Right.
However, if I already have that post loaded, it's going to say, well, I already have this data. The promise it returns is going to instantly fulfill. But then, in order to make sure it's not rendering stale data, it's going to do what's called a background reload. So it goes off in the background, refetches the post.
So if you were looking at a list of posts and you clicked on one, there's a situation where Ember Data says, I already have post 1. So it's like you just said, we'll give it to you right away.
And then we'll reload it in the background. So this can lead to some weird bugs, right? Where... Yeah, imagine your post is changing every second.
Right.
Then you render a page, and then it's like, flash, and new data comes in.
Right. And this is basically, you've introduced a new state to your app, and it's just hard to deal with that.
Yeah, because you never really thought, okay, how do I render a post that's out of date?
Right, exactly. You were never thinking about that when you're coding this template. What your intention was to say, no, I have a fresh post, and here's, again, my template is a description of what it should look like. So if you had this expires API, you could just say, what does it mean for a post to be fresh? Or what does it mean in the context of my app for a post to become stale?
So okay, let me try it from the declarative viewpoint. You would say, I want to render this post as long as the data was fetched in the last minute.
Exactly. So that way you're coding the template in one state. This template will never be rendered without a post that is at most 1 minute old.
Yes.
And that's it. That's all you have to do.
So think about, like, let's just run through these situations. I render a list of posts and I immediately click one, and it has the data. We're within that minute window, so it just renders the page.
Renders at sync. And it doesn't need a background reload because it's fresh. It has the data it needs.
We're in that
window.
Yep.
Yeah.
The other situation is I render a page, I go out and get a coffee, I come back, I click a link, and then now instead of instantly rendering that page, the route is going to block, fetch the data, then when the data is fetched, it'll render it.
Right, exactly. And of course there's other situations that happen in our interfaces where maybe some set of data is not completely stale. We want to show them the old version, and then we want to write some even more code to help smoothly transition to the new data. Let's say you had like a time series data visualization, and it's not that the old time series data is completely old, like completely useless and expired, but you would be able to, if you had this ability and you could ask, how stale is this, or how old is this, or whatever, then you could smoothly transition through these states. So it's not, I'm just making the point that if you had this dream API of ours, it's not to say that you lose the ability completely to instantly transition between UI states if you want to. The point is that you've thought about it, right? The problem exactly. The problem with the scenario you described is that the developer was never thinking about the fact that my template could render in these two states with the old data, and then all of a sudden it's going to refresh.
Now, just to push back a little, can you make the argument that, well, okay, sure, you never really thought about it, but Ember Data is kind of making your life easy because it's allowing you to instantly render the page, And then it's also fetching old data.
Yeah,
or fetching new data.
Right.
And also too, like, okay, most of the apps I work on, the data really doesn't change that often. So background reload tends to not have an effect.
Right. So if it tends not to have an effect, then I think maybe it shouldn't be enabled. Like if
that's true too. If it doesn't have effect, why do I even have it on?
Right, because when you do have it on, it has an effect. Okay, maybe there's some situations where a background reload basically does what you want. Like maybe you're looking at a list and the background reload comes in and it appends it to the bottom of the list. So now your feed is up to date, but the user didn't know and they were able to keep reading that first item or something like that. But I think I would argue, again, part of the whole declarative programming model is that you can look at your code, whether it's template code or route code, and you can say what I expect the app to look like. And this is a part of the flow that we've completely omitted. We've ignored, basically. It's not encapsulated in this declarative part of our code bases, and so it's left out.
I mean, not only that, it's just I have no idea. I didn't even think about this case.
Yes.
There's nothing they've even told me. Hey, there's this third state that your app could be in.
Right. Yeah. how many times has background reload or the other thing that storefront addresses, which is this when I coded this route for the post, I did find record post 1, but I included the comments and the tags. And because Ember Data knew about post 1, even though I had never loaded its comments and tags, it's going to give me a sync rendering to that route. And then those comments and tags maybe pop back in because of the background reload.
Right.
So that's another situation that comes up and that storefront is addressed. So my bigger point here is, when has background reload actually had a material impact on your app and you haven't had to code around it? Most of the time you have to code around it.
I know, like this might be the situation I'm thinking of is someone's using my, okay, so let's take a step back. A server rendered application.
Mm-hmm.
You load the page on a Tuesday, and then on a Thursday you click a link. You're gonna get the data, the render from Thursday. Right. So you click a link, that link is gonna be rendered on Thursday. In an Ember application, if you load the page on Tuesday and then you click a link on Thursday, well, you're gonna get the Ember app and the data, everything that came in on Tuesday. So I'm thinking that background reload, this is the area where background reload helps me. It makes my app behave more like a server rendered app.
But what if you were browsing GitHub, let's say, and repositories change often, again, my argument here is it'd be better for the developer
to say, when I click this link, just fetch the data.
Exactly. Just say that this data expires immediately. Whereas the blog posts on EmberMap.com, I would want to declare that they never expire.
Yeah, or a blog post that's 6 months old doesn't expire.
Yes,
blog
exactly.
post that's a day old,
maybe it
expires. Expired after an hour.
Exactly, and that way, if you have that Ember app open and you come back on Thursday and you click around, you still have the cache there. It's like more like a native app, right? Where if I had my calendar open or something like that, my email open, and I've already read these emails, they should still be fast.
So the thing is, background reload is making me think that, okay, it's always going to give me something that keeps my Ember app up to date, so I don't have to worry about these situations. But you're making the argument that these are states of your application, you need to be thinking of them. And there are good APIs like this never expires or this expires in 24 hours that make it easy for you to come in and think about
be declarative these. And for the system, offload as much of this work about reloading to the system as possible. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's basically the argument. Yeah.
Nice.
You buy it?
Yes.
Cool.
I mean, I'm just pushing back here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I do kind of like, there's part of me that likes background reload is kind of like, I'm basically saying that, yeah, I'm going to render some funky looking UI that's going to flash and data is going to change.
But it's better than someone missing out.
Right. It's going to behave like a server rendered app.
But I think you could wrap background reload in expires. You could even default expires things in, immediately, let's say, or even using the cache that storefront has so that it's scoped to a certain query. It's really the fact that the expires API would give you a way to get out of situations when you do run into things that background reload doesn't work, right? Because background reload is a subset of expires, right?
Right.
The behavior that background reload gives you is a subset where everything expires soon.
Right. Well, I was just thinking, if you want your app to behave like a server, then the data should just
expire immediately.
Exactly. Because that's how a server works. You click a link, you get a new render from the server.
Right. But we don't. We want to take advantage of the capabilities that Ember apps give us, and that involves a lot of that is because of caching. And if our Ember data store already knows about most of the data and that most of it is still relevant, then the app should be super snappy, and it shouldn't be making new requests and flashing our app.
Cool. Very cool. We didn't really explain what expires was.
So just to bring it back to the work we're doing on Storefront, this doesn't exist yet, but the idea is Storefront you can call find record and find all, just like you can with the Ember data store. But we have this notion of the route saying store.find record post 1, and then another option where you say expires, and then you could say in 1 hour. And then if the user uses the app for the hour, if they ever circle back to that route somehow, the Ember app and Storefront knows it has everything it needs, because you just look at, okay, what does this route declared it needs? And we already have it. Here you go. Otherwise, if it's been more than an hour, we're going to block and refresh.
So, and yeah, keeps your app in two states. I either have what I need or I don't have what I need. I need to make a query. None of this in between. I kind of have what I need, but just to be sure, I'm going to do a background reload, and this just doesn't make sense.
Exactly. And if you want to add a third state that shows, loading progress, then you just make a loading template.
Yeah.
Because you have a blocking promise. And now you've actually thought about what the app should look like if it's in this state where it has old data or it's intermittent between the previous route and the loading of the new route.
Mm-hmm. And you can also, if you want the background reload behavior, you can write code that does that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. So yeah, it's pretty cool. So you're gonna bang that out tomorrow during open source time?
Yeah. We'll see. Podcast driven development, dude.
Yeah, it's true. All right, well, I think that about wraps it up for today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see y'all next week.
Bye.
This podcast is sponsored by EmberMap.com, where you can find high-quality videos and blog posts made specifically for professional Ember developers. Sign up today to access all of our premium content, updated weekly.